someone in the procession shouted, "There is no door," and the crowd stopped, hushed before a blank wall. Suspicion pushed the narrator forward. He moved through pilgrims like a blade cutting fog, the leather strap of his notebook creaking against his coat. He reached the stone and felt the cold plane under his fingertips. The guardian stepped between him and the fire aide, palm flat on his kairas, and spoke in a low voice that cut the murmurs. "You do not cross." The immediate, physical problem was clear. A temple designed to be seen and not entered, and a guardian who turned approach into enforcement. The narrator had spent a decade cataloging sanctuaries and ritual thresholds. His notes lay in the leather, bound volume at his hip, margin annotations visible at the edge. He scanned the masonry with practiced hands, looking for seams, a reused lintel, evidence of a sealed doorway. His suspicion was not idle curiosity. It demanded documentation. He stepped closer, chin bent to read a joint, and the guardian tightened his stance. Narrator, the guardian, naming him as if naming were a jurisdiction. "You are not to touch the threshold." The name hung in the air. The narrator kept his hand where it rested and replied, "I will only measure the stone." The guardian's reply came as a gesture. A slow, deliberate removal of the iron key-shaped amulet from beneath his robe. Tension shifted into confrontation within minutes. The crowd pressed at the perimeter and 3 sentinels formed a loose ring. A pilgrim called out, "Why is there no door?" Acolytes across the square answered with a practiced hush. The narrator's notebook was open. His pen hovered. He wrote a single line sealed by design. He felt irritation replace the initial suspicion as the guardian held the amulet up between them like a statement. "This threshold is law." The guardian. It was never meant to open. The narrator's jaw tightened. He tapped the seam with a gloved knuckle and heard nothing but stone and the small click of his own pen. They moved to the perimeter at dusk, torches guttered. The narrator for plans, for records, and a young acolyte brought a folded sheet from a ruined archive 2 streets away. In the archive a lamp hung low. The paper smelled of smoke and dust. The narrator spread the schematic on a bench, and the directness of the lines removed the pleasant vagueness of speculation. The plan showed concentric geometry and annotations in an old script that named surfaces and sightlines but left no mark for an entrance. His suspicion hardened into a practical hypothesis. Architects had encoded absence as doctrine. He allowed. The plan was meant to prohibit crossing. The acolyte's hands trembled as he passed the paper back. "We are forbidden to show this," the acolyte whispered. An acolyte's unwillingness produced the first real reveal. He pushed a single folded corner toward the narrator and added, "There is a margin note. The threshold must remain whole. It is not a defect." The narrator read the line and felt a new emotion move through him, frustration. He stood and paced the archive's floorboards, the soles of his boots scuffing dust. Frustration changed his behavior. He tested the door again, the measuring rod tucked against his side, instruments in hand. The acolyte said, "You should not bring tools." The guardian reads that as provocation. The narrator, "Then have the guardian explain the doctrine." The acolyte looked away. Night pressed on the workshop where masons had once drawn their lines. The narrator set compasses and a folding measuring rod on the workbench and began tracing the same geometry from the schematic. Chalk dust tracked across his fingertips. As he traced an intersecting pair of arcs, the room chilled and the architect appeared at the far bench without a step, as if he had been granite embedded in the mortar. The appearance was a direct event. The architect lifted a hand and moved a compass's leg against the map. He did not speak. He pressed the compasses so the arcs met and tilted his head. The narrator felt the tilt like pressure against a wound. The architect's visitation produced 2 immediate emotion shifts. The narrator's earlier frustration narrowed into a sharpened reverence for construction detail, then broadened into unsettling uncertainty when an old motion in the architect's hand suggested intention rather than mistake. The architect traced a circle around an area labeled threshold and tapped the empty center. The narrator copied the motion with his own finger and felt that the grain of the bench under his fingertip. "Did you design it to be unenterable?" The architect's only reply was to press a thumb into the paper and leave an inked geometry. The absence had been chosen. The architect's action made doctrine physical. At dawn the narrator returned to the temple with a measuring rod and a small ritual implement wrapped in cloth. He intended to test acoustic slits and light alignment. The instrument would measure harmonic resonance, if any. The guardian met him at the outer ring and lifted his chin. "What will you do with metal against our stone?" The guardian. The narrator set the rod against the sealed dais and tapped in a measured rhythm. The first taps returned nothing. The second set brought a faint tone from a narrow slit at the building's side. A pilgrim near the slit stepped forward and pressed an ear. The pilgrim's face changed from puzzlement to a sudden, steady focus. The narrator felt fear as his hypothesis met unexpected physical response. The temple answered only to a precise approach, not brute force. The discovery of the acoustic slit shifted authority at once. The acolyte who had handed the plan stepped closer and said, "We have never let them perform it openly." The narrator looked at the acolyte and then at the guardian. "Who decides who approaches?" he asked. The guardian's stance did not change, but his voice tightened. "The threshold is held by the ritual of approach," he said. "Not anyone may perform its motion." The pilgrim who had listened to the slit murmured a line of a chant, and the narrow opening threw a thin band of light across the sealed stone. The band struck a carved sigil and caught dust motes, and for a second the day seemed like a map of geometry responding to the world. That moment produced a small mid-chapter cliffhanger. A supplicant in the crowd staggered and fell forward as the band of light crossed his chest. He gasped and the crowd sucked in air. Hands reached for him. The narrator shoved through and knelt, feeling the man's pulse, fingers pressed to a throat that was alive and racing but pale. The guardian ordered the sentinels to hold the perimeter tighter. He attempted the performance alone. The guardian, he broke the sequence. The narrator demanded, "What happens to those who break it?" The guardian did not answer verbally. He placed his amulet in the supplicant's chest as if to mark an oath. The supplicant's eyes looked past the narrator. Fear made his fingers clench on the guardian's iron amulet. The crowd's mood fractured into debate and sharp exchanges. Pilgrims argued at the ring's edge. "Let him speak," a woman shouted. He tried to follow the motion. "It is sacrilege," a man countered. "It will undo the order," another said. The narrator turned to the acolyte. "Tell me what the performance requires," he said. The acolyte named precise steps. An approach along a fixed sight line, a vocal cadence, pressure applied at a single notch in the stone. He recited the sequence like a list of coordinates. His voice carried the weight of an instruction rather than a chant. The narrator copied the steps into his notebook and underlined the phrase, "Controlled approach equals ritual power." Tension rose the next morning when a young pilgrim, named Mara by the acolyte, stepped from the crowd and said she had learned the cadence in a village shrine. She moved with a deliberate gait to the narrow approach and aligned her shoulders to the slit. The narrator watched her adjust her hands on the worn rope at the perimeter and then begin the cadence out loud, short syllables struck with precise timing. The narrator felt a shift from suspicion to cautious hope. If a lay pilgrim could trigger alignment, the doctrine was less about permanent exclusion and more about who was permitted to perform the sequence. The guardian closed his eyes briefly and then opened them, iron amulet hanging low. He showed the motion. Mara completed the cadence, and the slit opened its answer again. Light cut across the days, landing on a carved sigil. The stone responded with a low harmonic murmur. The architect's doctrine that absence was meaning suddenly took on an operational texture. The narrator recorded the cadence, the exact angle Mara used, the pressure she put into the rope. He saw the guardian's fingers flex around the amulet and recognized a choice: enforcement by prohibition or management through ritual. He, the guardian, do you keep them out or teach them the motion? The guardian looked at the crowd and then at the narrator. "We teach only those chosen by lineage and readiness," he said. "The motion is not for spectacle." The narrator wrote the guardian's words and watched a debate flare in 3 voices among the pilgrims, each line a short sentence of claim and counterclaim. An unexpected mechanism shifted the power of interpretation. The acolyte pulled the narrator aside and showed a marginal notation on the plan. A hidden acoustic slit had been intentionally aligned with a remote parapet opening so that sound and light could be controlled from above. They designed 2 authorship points. The acolyte said, "One who guards the surface, one who performs the alignment." The narrator felt a surge of clarity, then alarm. Because this meant the guardian could enforce absence by withholding alignment, and someone above could create the appearance of a miraculous response. The narrator whispered, "Then the doctrine can be staged." The acolyte's lips tightened. "Staged, and therefore political," he said. The crowd coalesced toward the parapet for the climax. The narrator moved up a narrow stair with the acolyte and found the guardian already there. Amulet at his throat and the architect's measured geometry carved into the parapet stones. Pilgrims pressed at the lower ring. Voices rose. The narrator, the guardian, who authorized the alignment today. The guardian named no person. "I authorized the defense of the threshold," The narrator stepped to the parapet's edge and looked down at Mara as she prepared the cadence below. If you withhold the alignment, you change what this means for everyone." The guardian's reply was emotion. His arm rose and his hand blocked the narrator's reach toward the amulet. The confrontation reached its peak when a supplicant from the lower ring surged forward to demand access. The guardian blocked him physically. Sentinels braced. "You cannot pass." The supplicant shouted, "We need to know if the rites can include us!" The guardian pushed back, and the narrator stepped between them. Rapid lines of dialogue followed, 3 to 5 exchanges that broke and reformed as each character pushed their claim. Narrator, "Step back." The guardian, "No." The narrator answered, "You keep the lock. We need the truth. Truth is enforced here." The guardian, "You test and you break people." The guardian added, "We will not teach the unready." The guardian finished. The supplicant cursed and was hauled away by sentinels. At the instant of highest tension, the parapet's alignment flared. A narrow shaft of ritual light struck the sealed dais, and a carved sigil flashed with reflected amber. The crowd gasped. The supplicant who had been pulled back began to sway. His mouth opened and he whispered a syllable that matched Mara's cadence. The guardian clutched his amulet and then, in a motion that was nearly a seizure of duty, pressed the key, shaped amulet against his sternum and spat the word, "Contain." The narrator felt adrenaline cut through his limbs. The architect's spectral outline at his shoulder seemed to lean and confirm the geometry. The crowd fell into a brittle hush. The aftermath unfolded quickly and precisely. The supplicant, breathing hard, was led away with the amulet dangling from a treated rope. The guardian replaced the amulet beneath his robe and turned to the narrator. "You have seen it now," he said. "Write what you will, but the threshold remains sealed." The narrator tasted something like resentment and a new resolve. He would not only record the physical facts but also the mechanisms by which ritual power was maintained. He closed his notebook briefly, then reopened it and wrote the words, "Controlled performance, enforced absence." The acolyte touched his sleeve and said, "Keep the plan safe. They will not forgive exposure." The narrator folded the schematic, wrapped it in oilcloth, and slid it into his satchel. He left the temple with the crowd thinning behind him. His hands smelled of stone dust and candles. He had recorded steps, angles, and a guarded exchange. He had witnessed a near sacrificial enforcement. He also carried a new immediate duty, to show evidence that absence was doctrine. The final event of the day was the guardian's last visible motion, a slow raising of his hand as if blessing the sealed wall. The narrator watched it, and then, with his notebook closed and the amulet's heat still in the supplicant's palm, he walked away down the road, the temple's blank forehead receding into the late light. He had a folded schematic, the acolyte's margin note, and a witness to the moment the doctrine asserted itself. He kept his pen ready for the next entry, and the memory of the guardian's iron key pressed into his palm as he joined the first bend in the road. A pilgrim thrust his open palm against the temple's blank face, and a sentinel's hand clamped over it before the crowd could breathe. Suspicion tightened the narrator's steps. He moved between pilgrims with the leather strap of his notebook scraping his coat. Shouts rose and fell as the pilgrim recoiled, rubbing a reddened palm where the sentinel had stopped him. The narrator remembered the procession's earlier cry that had halted them all. Someone had said the building had no door. And that memory pushed him forward faster than reverence or curiosity alone. The narrator reached the stone and pressed his fingertips to the surface where the pilgrim had struck. His fingers met cool, unbroken ashlar. He tasted dust and old sweat. He did not step back. Suspicion shaped his hands. He probed joints, tapped beneath carved grooves, sought seams where a mason might have hidden a seam. He kept his voice low when he spoke because the guardian watched and because the courtyard held its breath. The narrator, the guardian, speaking the name like a label that must be tested. "You are not a supplicant." The guardian's palm did not leave the amulet at his throat. He moved like someone whose limbs were measured ritual tools rather than flesh. "I am not here to pray," the narrator replied. "I am here to record." He crouched, set down the notebook, and opened it to a blank spread. He laid out his folding rod and a small lamp on the flagstones. The guardian stepped closer and displayed the iron key-shaped amulet between thumb and forefinger. The metal was worn to a dull sheen where fingers had held it for years. He drew a short, formal line in the air with the amulet before returning it to his chest. The motion sealed more than a pledge. It converted refusal into ritual. "Do not touch the face." The guardian, "Do not force it with curiosity." The sentence was not a plea but an incantation of duty. The narrator read the line of the lintel as if it were a sentence. He traced a carved groove with a fingertip and found a repeating geometry. A shallow chevron repeated along the course of the stone. He set the compasses beside his rod and began to measure the angles aloud. He spoke numbers in a quiet cadence, letting the courtyard count with him. Pilgrims murmured. Someone tried to edge closer and was hauled back by a sentinel. The narrator's suspicion shifted to doubt when the guardian's face did not register surprise, but something like ritual satisfaction. The guardian, did you know this was designed without a practical aperture? He kept his wrists steady while he held the compasses. The guardian's jaw tightened. This face denies entry by doctrine, not by ruin. He did not explain doctrine. He invoked it. His eyes flicked to the crowd and then to the narrator's notebook. A young pilgrim pushed through and reached out, palm flat, toward a carved sigil. A sentinel struck his arm away. The guardian's hand struck the pilgrim's shoulder with a flat firmness that left the pilgrim breathing raggedly. The narrator's doubt hardened into irritation. He closed the compasses and rose. Tell me the doctrine. The narrator, tell me why the stone answers as it does. His voice held a measured impatience. He noticed, then, the iron scab of ritual scars along the guardian's jaw and the inked sigil at his brow. Physical details replaced abstract questions. They were evidence. The guardian replied with a gesture. The amulet lifted, the same small line traced in the air. Not now, he said. You will not pass. He took a step back and folded his arms as if shutting a gate with his body. The narrator did not step away. He opened the notebook, sketched a quick plan, and began to reconstruct the wall's geometry against his rod and sketches. He read numbers aloud and compared them to known temple modules. Bay widths, bonding patterns, the fall of the roof. The figures did not add up to a hidden door. The narrator the word out loud to force it into the open. It isn't accidental. The plan eliminates any functioning portal. He tapped the rod against the stone where a threshold might logically sit. A woman in the crowd said, "There should be a door here," her voice cut clean through the murmurs. The crowd turned. The guardian's hand tightened on his amulet. The guardian stepped forward and pushed his palm flat to the stone. He made a short formal chant under his breath, 3 syllables in a rhythm the narrator could not map. The chant ended with the guardian driving the amulet against the stone until the iron's edge left a faint crescent of scraped dust. The surface did not yield. The narrator's suspicion shifted again, this time toward unease. He felt the pendant at his throat, the small polished obsidian beneath the scarf. He had worn it through other ruins and found only cold. Tonight it caught a minute warmth against his skin. He did not name the feeling. Instead he moved to a glyph, carved recess a handspan from the lintel and set the pendant against the carved line. When the obsidian touched the incised groove, the carved line glowed faintly along a single course. The glow was a thin shader of orange, like a vein of copper warmed and visible through stone. Several people gasped. The guardian's hand dropped to his belt. His shoulders shifted as if pulled by a cord. The pilgrim who had pressed his palm earlier spat and said, "What is that?" The crowd swelled toward the light. Hands reached. A sentinel shoved a shoulder into the pressing bodies. The narrator pulled the pendant away. The line faded like a breath leaving a lantern. He did not smile. He wrote down the observation, obsidian resonance with glyph, transient emissive. Numbers followed words. He folded the rod and compared the light's pattern to the geometry he had drawn. The guardian's temper, which had been restrained by ritual, snapped into motion. He seized the narrator by the arm and hauled him away from the lintel. The narrator's notebook fell open against the flagstones, pages splaying with ink and a folded plan half exposed. The guardian's palm pressed into the narrator's shoulder with sufficient force to bruise. "You profane a test. The guardian, you force what was meant to remain a trial." His voice moved from ritual cadences to plain accusation. The narrator struggled for the notebook in one hand and kept the lamp steady with the other. The guardian, the narrator, steadying himself. The geometry shows intent. The plan cannot support an entrance. Who designed this? He used the name to focus the exchange and to bind the guardian to reply. The guardian's jaw worked. "You ask questions like a supplicant asks a blessing. You do not understand initiation." He pushed the narrator toward a makeshift table where the guardian's belt of pouches sat. "If you will not step away, then you will be marked as an investigator, not a pilgrim. That changes what we may do to you." He palmed the iron amulet and set it on the stone as if it were a final seal. Several sentinels closed ranks, forming a ring around the courtyard. The crowd fell into a hushed press. The narrator felt a vibration through the soles of his boots, the measured steps of men keeping watch. He knew then that this confrontation had shifted from an academic demonstration to an enforced ritual response. He spoke aloud to the crowd, "Look at the coursing here. See the offsets at bay 3 and 5, he tapped the sketch. These choices remove threshold geometry. They direct an approach without allowing entry. He pointed to the lintel and indicated the carved chevrons. He used the gestures of a teacher to demand attention, to break the panic into study. A woman from the crowd, Maris, stepped forward and forced the question that had been building. The Guardian, is absence itself initiation? Her voice carried because she held a torch high. The Guardian's eyes flicked to Maris. Yes, he said, absence is a test of obedience and of separation. The temple requires approach and refusal. He did not explain further. Maris pressed her torch against the stone, close enough for wax to drip but not to burn. The flame licked the carved sigil and left a smear of soot. You asked the narrator to accept doctrine without proof, she said. Why should we obey a shape that refuses itself? The Guardian did not answer immediately. He turned his head and, for an instant, the narrator saw the vertical white of the Guardian's teeth as he considered the crowd. Then he made a slow, deliberate decision. He stepped back from the stone and touched the amulet at his throat. You will not pass, he repeated, but you may watch the trial of the wall. Keep distance, he signaled the sentinels to widen their circle. The crowd drew back. The narrator took a lamp and set it near the lintel again. He did not touch the stone. He wrote and schematized by the lamp a small cone of light. The Guardian resumed his position and adopted a posture of ritual rest. Hands kept above the waist, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on the narrator. The courtyard quieted to a low susurration of breath and rustling cloth. Hours passed with the narrator measuring, drawing, and speaking numbers aloud. He tested bonds with gentle taps and listened for differences in pitch. He traced mortar joints and compared bedding lines. The Guardian interrupted twice to rebuke him, and once to exchange short phrases with a sentinel at the parapet. When the bell in the bell house struck midnight, the temperature dropped enough that the breath of the crowd showed in the lamplight. The narrator set aside the rod and rid a rubbing he had taken of a particular sigil. The rubbing revealed a micro-geometry. Interlocking arcs that cancelled linear continuity where an opening would be. He read it aloud. Arc 1 cancels plane 3, Arc 2 denies jam clearance. There is no structural allowance for a door. He kept his voice low so that the explanation remained evidence rather than provocation. The architect's presence entered the courtyard then, but not as a figure stepping from shadow. The narrator sensed the architect in the way the light bent when it moved across certain carvings. He saw nothing physical at first. He saw instead pattern coherence forming in his mind, as if someone else were tracing the same plan over his sketches. The architect's manner, tilting of an imaginary head, the invented habit of tracing lines in the air, came to the narrator as a precise mental overlay. The narrator spoke to that overlay. Who are you in these lines? He asked aloud, half to the courtyard and half to himself. A narrow seam in the lintel loosened then, as if a hairline crack had been pulled along an unseen joint. A single, slithered beam of pale light materialized where no seam had existed moments before. It lasted one breath. People grabbed lampstands and craned necks. The seam closed as if a hand had pressed it shut. Silence hit the courtyard like a struck drum. The narrator's heart accelerated, but he did not use the word fear. Instead, he felt his hands go slick and his mouth dry. He reached for the notebook and wrote the word transient aperture in a quick, tight hand. He recorded the exact time according to the bell. Midnight and a dozen seconds. The Guardian's fingers trembled on his amulet. He did not look at the narrator with accusation now, but with a different, older burden. A duty that required him to answer not as sentinel, but as executor of a doctrine. He lowered his voice. The wall answers for a moment. The Guardian, it tests us. It will not open for us to enter. It opens to show what absence is meant to teach. You saw it. You are marked. He did not raise his hand to strike, but the accusation in the motion carried weight. Maris bent and picked up a shard of soot that had fallen where the glow had brightened. She held it out. It emitted light like embers, she said. It is not simple stone. Her hands shook only a little. The narrator took the shard and set it beside his lamp. He rolled it on the vellum page and recorded its texture and color. The crowd started to push forward again, curiosity overcoming the initial fear, sentinels readied to hold them back. The narrator felt his suspicion fold into two directions, a need to prove the anomaly with repeated tests, and a recognition that some forces here did not obey his method. He had moved from suspicion to methodical doubt and now toward acute caution. The guardian stepped away from the lintel and then did something unexpected. He laid the iron amulet on the stone between the two of them and touched it with both hands. He spoke one short line of ritual that the narrator did not understand. The guardian then looked directly at the narrator and offered two paths. You may leave with this knowledge and record what you have seen, the guardian, or you may accept an obligation and stand watch. Choose now. His voice carried no threat in words but in consequence. The offer turned the incident into a decision with personal cost. The narrator hesitated. He opened his mouth to answer, and then remembered the procession, the earlier shout that had stopped them before the blank face. He thought of the architect's lines and how they made absence into doctrine. He thought of the care with which the guardian carried the amulet, and of the scars along the guardian's jaw. Maris pressed forward. Do not make him decide alone, she said. He is a recorder, not a sentinel. He does what he must to know. She used the narrator's name to pull him out of indecision. The narrator, your choice will be seen. Choose with our witness. Her torch flared. The narrator looked at the crowd, at the folding rod, at the lamp, at the small obsidian pendant at his throat. He felt the rush of motion under his ribs and set the notebook on the stone. He wrote a single line. Transient aperture observed. Guardian offered duty. He dated the entry and closed the book with a soft snap. I will not take your place tonight, he said, but I will trace this doctrine further. I accept an obligation to return with proof. He spoke the words as a commitment that cost him something. Time, access, the safety of leaving. He used choice to move forward rather than retreat into analysis. The guardian accepted the decision with a small, almost imperceptible nod. He took up the amulet and, in a motion that felt like both blessing and binding, laid it against the narrator's palm for a breath before withdrawing it. The crowd exhaled. Sentinels uncurled their formation. The narrator tucked the notebook beneath his coat and said, I will record the thread of your doctrine, guardian. I will map the architect. He used those names to fix obligations. The guardian answered with one short line, map it well. Narrator, he kept the words minimal and full. The narrator left the courtyard before dawn. He took one last look back and saw the guardian silhouetted against the parapet, the amulet at his throat glinting in the first grey light. He walked to the narrow alley and sat on a low step. He opened the notebook and wrote the full entry. Measurements, the pendant reaction, the transient aperture, the guardian's offer, Maris' testimony, and the time stamp. He closed the book, pushed the strap through its brass catch and stood. He did not promise to take the watch. He promised to return with proof. That promise folded into the decisions he would make next. To follow the architect's measured geometry, to speak with masons who still remembered older modules, and to test the pendant against other glyphs. The last sentence he wrote before the bell of morning was a clear directive. Trace the architect's doctrine. Question the ritual of absence. He closed the notebook, dated the entry, and walked toward the narrow alley with the guardian's offer pressed like an iron coin in his pocket. Moonlight struck the trench in a hard white ribbon when the narrator pushed the last chip of mortar free and revealed a hairline aperture carved into the temple's foundation. Suspicion tightened his fingers around the bronze compass in his palm, and he pushed without announcing himself. The apprentice's breath came quick beside him. The narrator felt the leather strap of his notebook bite into his shoulder as if reminding him of the record he must keep. A small keyhole lay beneath a border cut with precise geometry, its inner lip engraved with parallel arcs. The discovery made the problem plain. The wall was not merely blank, it hid a mechanism. That was the central conflict now, whether the blank facade concealed an entrance to be opened, or whether the opening itself was sacrament and danger. He crouched and rid the incision with his fingertips. Suspicion moved him to check details others might ignore. The narrator's storm, grey eyes angled under his spectacles. He traced the arcs once, twice, and leaned so close the stone's cold rose through his gloves. He had come to record to test, to expose architecture's intention. His motive narrowed into a single question that would direct every step that night. The apprentice scraped loose the last sliver of mortar and let the fragment fall into the dark. He had not expected the guardian to arrive with the low, staccato tread of a man who had kept a parapet for decades. The guardian appeared at the trench's rim and dropped a shadow that swallowed the apprentice's lamp. Stop, the guardian. And the voice carried a small weight that made the apprentice flinch backward. The narrator straightened and showed his hands. He kept his voice even. We only want to see, he said. The narrator, we mean no harm. The guardian's jaw tightened. The guardian, no instrument may touch the seam. He stepped down with a deliberate slow bore motion, palms open in ritual rest. The narrator noted the iron amulet at the guardian's throat, and the way the man's breathing hitched on the word instrument. The confrontation was immediate and practical. Tools versus prohibition, curiosity versus duty. The narrator's suspicion shifted into defiant curiosity. He set the compass on the stone and tapped a mark. Why is there a keyhole? The narrator who carved this at the base. The guardian's shoulders drew in. The guardian, you do not ask that here. He reached out and tried to cover the aperture with two broad fingers. The narrator kept his hand over the compass. The narrator, we will only measure. Outside the trench, a breeze swept dust along the temple face and carried the sound of a distant pilgrim's cough. The narrator saw tradcraft in the cut lines. Compass arcs, pin chambers, a shallow channel scored as if for a slender slide. The apprentice murmured, it could be a lock. The guardian closed his mouth and took a step back, the guardian not to be opened. He set his boots on the stone rim and looked at the narrator as if weighing the scale of duty against the man who carried a notebook and an oblong pendant. The architect arrived before dawn, moving along the parapet with hands that traced air. He did not call. The narrator knew the shape of the man's gait from older records. Someone who measured silence. The architect's fingers hovered over the engraved arcs, and he spoke in the voice that sounded filtered through cold stone. The architect, the cutter lines with the days below. The narrator stepped closer. The narrator, show me. The architect produced bronze compasses from within his apron and set one point into the stone's arc. He drew an invisible cord with the tip, his ink-stained fingertips leaving a faint smudge on the rough. The architect, the geometry forces meaning. The absence is ordered. His eyes were pale blue pins. He tilted his head and added, the architect, a mechanism opens a view, not passage. That sentence planted a new doubt. The narrator's suspicion shifted toward bewilderment. If the cut disclosed a view but forbade entry, then the temple's blank face performed doctrine, not concealment alone. The narrator felt the movement of thought become a duty. He must expose the function and record its reality precisely. He listed the possible outcomes aloud and wrote shorthand into his notebook while he spoke. The narrator, if it opens to a chamber, we measure. If it moves only to reveal, we note the form and seal it. The architect nodded and handed a folded measuring rod to the apprentice. The guardian's fingers closed on the amulet at his throat. The trench became an accord of roles. The narrator who would document, the architect who would read the lines, the guardian who would perform the limit. They worked by instruction. The architect set the compasses, the apprentice cranked a hidden pin the way the architect indicated, and the narrator guided the motion with notes. At dawn the ranked stone slid with the soft squeal of iron on stone. A narrow vertical slit opened, 2 palms wide and no more. A pale shaft of pre-dawn light cut down into a sealed shaft. Cold air tasted of dirt and stone and something metallic. The narrator bent toward the dark and felt the page of his notebook press against his chest like a map. The view revealed a days below, carved like an empty throne. Letters, small, strict, and repeated, circled the platform. The apprentice's fingers brushed a fallen candle stub inside the slit. Apprentice mason, there are incisions on the dais. He pushed the lamp closer and it illuminated the carved injunctions, short imperatives in a language the narrator could pass into forbidding commands. When the apprentice reached toward the void, the chamber answered. A pressure, immediate and localized, shoved against the apprentice's palm so hard that he reeled and stumbled back. His lamp tilted and sputtered. The narrator caught the apprentice's shoulder and heard the man's breath staccato in his throat. The pressure had weight. It was not metaphor. The narrator's emotion shifted again. Curiosity curdled into alarm. He checked the compass needle, his hand small and steady. The compasses trembled against the stone. The narrator, what happens if we let it be seen and not touched? The guardian, you do not test like that. The architect's fingers flew across a measuring mark. The architect, the opening aligns with an axis. The force is an effect of geometry and right together. He looked at the narrator and, for the first time that night, his voice pitched near panic. The architect, stop if you value your senses. The narrator had come to prove that architecture could encode doctrine. The physical recoil of the apprentice's hand made doctrine felt like resistance. He felt his pulse in his throat, steady racing beneath his scarf. He made a decision in a series of small, visible moves. He wrote a precise instruction in his notebook, folded a page, and set the bronze compass into the slit as the architect prescribed. The apprentice turned the pin. Air rushed out with a sound like a bell's faint hollow. A narrow portion of the dais came into view. A carved depression in the shape of a seat, empty, its surface burnished by deliberate abrasion. Around the seat runes instructed yet did not name. The narrator peered into the gap and smelled candle wax and cold cedar. He listened for any sign of breath below. Nothing spoke back. The narrator's voice came low. The narrator, do you see written injunctions? Read them. The architect read aloud with the thin reedy cadence he used when counting angles. The architect, do not enter with hunger. Do not force threshold, offer 10 measure in silence. His fingers made a small motion as if putting coins into a box. The narrator wrote each word exactly, noting accents and stop marks. Each line of the injunction shifted his calculation of risk. The guardian moved. He set both hands on the trench rim and performed a small ritual gesture with the iron amulet. The guardian, I will seal what must be sealed. He did not explain the process. He only reached for the leather pouch at his belt. The narrator covered his notebook with one gloved hand. The architect leaned forward. The architect, it will only be shown to be empty. It will not accept a body. The mechanism repels until the geometry finds a countervailing measure. He tapped the compasses into his palm. The architect, I am the only one who knows the alignment well enough. The narrator needs the measurement to publish. The architect's jaw worked. The architect, publish what? A record that hurts people. The narrator, publish the architecture. They argued in short bursts. The narrator kept the lines factual. The architect argued with precise geometric terms. The guardian's objections were ritual and blunt. The apprentice stayed silent and held the lamp closer to the slit. Their exchange tightened into a confrontation. The guardian turned the instrument over. The narrator, I will not surrender it without a copy. The guardian, you cannot bargain about the threshold. The narrator writes numbers and diagrams. Give me minutes. The architect moved between them and placed his hand on the narrator's shoulder. The architect, there is one way to know what lies beneath. An aligned descent. But only one of us is permitted to close the alignment once opened. His voice tightened. His wrist flexed on the compasses as if the instrument were a talisman. The narrator saw the man tremble. He decided then to test the limit personally. If the mechanism repelled a metal hand, did it repel intention? He would not force a body. He would attempt a measured approach. He fed the compass through the slit and attached a rope to the apprentice's belt. The apprentice agreed with a gaunt nod, and the narrator began to lower the measuring rod. At the slit's mouth the air pushed outward like a living thing. The apprentice's shoulders bowed as if a hand had seized him. He grunted. The narrator felt the compasses strain at their anchor. Apprentice Mason, the rope is tight. His voice cut. The narrator leaned back and took 2 governed steps. He counted the marks on the rod and felt an electrical sting along his fingertips. The stone seemed to press back. The movement shifted to rapid action. The architect shouted arc numbers and the guardian intoned a sealing phrase. The narrator pulled his hand from the rope. When the apprentice's lamp sputtered and went low, the narrator's breath hitched in a way that tightened his throat. His pulse was a hammered rhythm he could hear in his ears. He checked for physical injury on the apprentice. The apprentice's face was pale. There was a smear of wax on his cheek. The narrator, stop now. The guardian will close it. The narrator felt fear then, a tactile constriction in his hands and throat. He had expected denial. He had not expected a force that pushed. The narrator's emotion shifted from alarm to fear. He reeled to a decision. Preserve the apprentice, preserve the record, or preserve truth at cost. The architect suddenly snatched at the compasses and shoved a bronze tip along the side of the slit. His fingers bled faintly where the bronze pin cut him. The architect, no, wait, measure this chord. He forced a phrase out that sounded like triumph and warning in the same bone. The architect, if I do not finish, the effect will remain unpredictable. That was a new reveal. The architect's obsession had purpose. He had designed the mechanism to be both test and trap. He had not told the guardian everything. The narrator registered a twist that required responsibility. If the architect had encoded a contingency, then the guardian's prohibition and the architect's compulsion were entangled. The narrator's suspicion sharpened into an understanding that the architect might create danger to prove doctrine. The narrator did not shout. He recorded the exchange instead. He wrote the architect's words and the guardian's gestures. He watched the architect set a final line, his hands shaking and lips worked. The architect whispered an incantation in geometry, and the slit widened another inch, exposing more of the days. Inside, a shallow bowl lay embedded near the throne. It contained a pale residue and a small iron nail. The apprentice's hand hovered over the bowl. He reached, and the same repulsive pressure struck him, so hard he dropped the lamp. It shattered. Darkness flared and then steadied as the narrator struck his own lamp and shaded it with his palm. The suddenness formed a mid-chapter cliffhanger. Would the apprentice be harmed, or would they pull away in time? They pulled away. The apprentice cuffed and spat wax. The architect stumbled and nearly toppled into the trench. The narrator steadied the man with a gloved hand and felt a faint warmth where the architect's shoulder hit his chest. The narrator: we stop now. We record and we seal. The architect's hands trembled. He gripped the compasses as if they might fall through his skin. The architect: no. I must finish the formula. The architect must finish. His insistence created conflict. The guardian stepped toward the architect. The guardian: you will not complete this alone. 3 quick lines followed, an argument in compressed forms. The architect: I know the axis. The narrator: we record the axis. The guardian: you betray your duty if you persist. The architect snapped the compasses open and set them across the carved runes. His chin bumped the stone as he bent low. He closed his eyes briefly and began to trace a chord. The narrator watched every motion and wrote each angle. The guardian performed a small rubbing at the edge of the slit and pulled out the iron amulet. He held it above the gap as a threat and as an offering. Then the climactic collision happened. The narrator leaned forward to look deeper, and his shoulder brushed the architect's elbow. At the same instant, the pressure from the slit slammed outward. It struck the narrator at the sternum like a hard hand and shoved him back. He dropped his lamp. The compasses slipped from his fingers and tumbled into the slit. A sound high and thin rang from the bowl below. The architect snapped a breath, and the guardian fell to his knees, the amulet clattering to stone. The narrator felt an upsurge of raw physical pain across his chest and ribs. He gasped and coughed. He could not breathe properly for a moment. The world became an array of sharp details: the ruff of his coat collar, the scar over his left eyebrow, the taste of iron on his tongue. He managed to push himself upright. The narrator: I cannot go down. I am repelled. The architect lurched forward so quickly the narrator thought he would topple. The architect: no, stay. Finish the line. The architect's hand darted and nearly forced the narrator's chin toward the slit. The architect: we must complete the geometry or the effect remains unstable. The guardian seized the architect's wrist. The guardian: stop. Now the argument erupted into a rapid exchange of short lines. The architect: you do not understand. The guardian: I understand my duty. The narrator: record it now. The architect: I will not be stopped. The guardian: you will be bound. The narrator: right now. There were 6 sharp deliveries in a row. The architect's voice cracked on the 4th phrase. The guardian's movements were a sequence of ritual gestures. The narrator barked orders like a registrar. His words were short and practical. The back and forth forced decisions and revealed motives. The architect's compulsion to complete and reveal. The guardian's obsession with preservation. The narrator's demand for record and restraint. The architect's hands finally stilled. He pressed his palms flat on the stone and inhaled. The architect: I will leave the compasses. I will not force a further breach. He set the bronze instruments on the edge of the slit with the care of someone laying down a child's toy. He looked at the narrator and then at the guardian. The architect: you seal. I leave the measure. Keep the compasses as proof that I tried. The guardian took the compasses without ceremony and weighed them in his palms. He nodded once. The guardian: we will seal, and the compasses will remain in sight of the stone. If you publish, you must answer for what happens. The narrator swallowed. He had a choice: insist on open publication or accept the reseal to prevent further harm. He pictured the apprentice's lamp broken on the ground, the wax crusted and black. He thought of the pilgrims who had touched the blank wall months ago and of the man who had shouted, "There is no door." He felt responsibility as a ledger of touchable facts. He set his notebook on the stone, opened to the page where he had drawn the arcs, and wrote his final note in block letters. The narrator: I will not publish the method. I will record exact dimensions and hand them to you. He pushed the page forward. The guardian's face did not soften, but his hands closed in a less rigid way. The guardian will take those records. The amulet will be driven into the seam. The guardian will watch. The guardian performed the sealing rite with a set of deliberate movements. He placed the iron amulet at the slit and struck it with a short hammer until the rim sat flush with the stone. He wrapped a strip of dark cloth through the amulet and tied it in a knot the narrator could recognize from older chronicles. The sound of iron biting stone was small and finite. The architect slid back and folded his arms as if exhausted. When the last strike landed, the narrator felt a pressure ease like a released band, the trench filled with the ordinary noises of men breathing and tools cooling. The architect uncurled and set his compasses on the ground beside his foot. He offered them to the narrator with a quick, inward nod. The architect, take this. Keep it. Know that I tried. The narrator hesitated a single heartbeat. Then he folded the compasses into his coat and tied a page of the notebook around them so they would not jostle. He had a record now that was both physical and moral. He had seen the mechanism, felt the resistance, witnessed the ritual sealing. He had also seen the architect's need to finish and the guardian's duty to prevent harm. Each man had acted in keeping with a role. After the sealing, they set a temporary camp. The narrator transcribed diagrams and angles into careful sketches, noting the compass spreads and arc numbers. The architect left pigments and a small folded sheet of notes in the narrator's hand. The architect, do not make my failure a spectacle. He tied his measuring rod to his belt and then walked away toward the parapet. He did not look back. The guardian returned to his post with the hard motion of a man resuming a watch. He strapped his amulet near the slit and resumed the ritual rest posture. The apprentice sat with his hands cupped around a warmed tin cup while the narrator checked his own notes again and again. The narrator's last recorded observation that morning was not a flourish but a directive. He sealed one extra sheet into a leather envelope and handed it to the guardian, the narrator for the guardian. Exact angles, entry attempt, and the measurements of the slit. Keep it under watch. The guardian accepted the envelope without speaking. He slid it under his belt pouch and set his jaw. The architect stepped close for a moment and left his bronze compasses by the stone where the guardian could see them. The architect, if anyone asks, say I returned the instruments and left the rest to duty. The narrator closed his own notebook and felt the weight of it against his ribs. He had completed his measure. He had been repelled and had seen the temple insist upon its absence. He had watched two men keep to their roles, one to prevent that which might break people, the other to admit the structure's deliberate incompleteness. He had chosen to prioritize containment over publication and had left behind a precise record with those sworn to guard the threshold. As morning brightened into a thin, cold sun, the narrator placed a final sketch atop the sealed slit and positioned his leather-bound notebook on the flat of the stone so that its strap caught the light. The guardian fitted the last knot in the sealing cloth and stood. The architect walked toward the parapet without his measuring rod. The apprentice rose to his feet and spit a small wad of wax from his mouth. They all moved like men finishing a formal chore. The narrator started to speak then, but instead he lifted his pen and set one more line in the notebook. The date, the exact compass spreads, and a notation in shorthand that the slit had been sealed by iron amulet and ritual knot. He slid the small satchel of pigments the architect had left into his coat. He closed the notebook and tightened the leather strap so it would not open in the dark. The narrator did not promise to publish publicly. He had seen what the mechanism did. He had heard the architect's unwilling admission and the guardian's refusal to relinquish duty. He accepted the decision they had forced upon him. The measure would exist, but the method would not be released to curious hands. He handed the guardian an extra page with simple diagrams and a request appended. The narrator, if the temple is ever to be studied safely, let it be with strict oversight and only through instruments kept here. The guardian took it, folded it once, and slid it into his pouch. He nodded. The narrator felt an odd tightening in his shoulders that he could not name. He tucked his hands into his gloves and turned away. Before he left, the narrator set the bronze compasses back at the edge of the slit where the architect had placed them and left a strip of his own handwriting beneath them. An exact time, the apprentice's name and the words, sealed under witness. The architect watched him do this from the parapet and raised a single palm in acknowledgement. The guardian watched the envelope move under his belt and did not speak. The crowd would still come and lay palms against the blank façade. Pilgrims would murmur familiar words and shuffle away believing parity had been kept. The narrator kept the knowledge that the temple's absence operated by design, that it could repel, and that those who enforced its boundary had both secret knowledge and stern obligations. He walked away with the leather strap of his notebook creaking against his coat. The morning air bit his cheeks and the scent of cold stone and old parchment clung to him. At the path's turn, he paused and took one last look. The temple face presented its plane, unbroken by a doorway. The guardian had returned to parapet and stood like a sentinel carved in flesh. The architect had left one bronze compass within reach. The narrator adjusted his spectacles, checked the stitches of his gloves, and began to walk back along the ruined alley toward the town. He had a record. He had a choice he had already made. He had sealed away a method to keep people safe. The last concrete event of the morning settled into place when the narrator turned and with steady fingers buttoned his dark scholar's coat. The button closed over his notebook strap, and he walked toward the road.